my that is my focus with the work I do, is the welfare of captive whales and dolphins, the welfare of captive marine mammals in general, when they are held for performances, in particular in zoos and aquariums and marine theme parks such as SeaWorld. I'm very concerned that these animals don't thrive in captivity, but the larger species, such as orcas and belugas, do not even cope very well. There's a difference between coping and thriving. Coping is just doing the best you can. Thriving is doing really, really well. They don't do either. So why? Why don't they do either? Why aren't they coping well in captivity? The main reason is they're big animals and they're put into a small space. And I think that's very easy for all of us to understand. When you are really, really big, and I mean, that's true for even somebody who's 6'5", you know, when they're put into a small seat on an airplane, it's very cramped. Well, that's what these animals are doing, are being subjected to. They're being held in very cramped quarters. So ignore the small print. Those are just the sources for the data I'm providing for you. So if you were really concerned about where I get my information from, these are peer-reviewed papers where these data come from. So if you notice here, it says that orcas can swim multiple kilometers in a straight line and are capable of traveling as many as 225 kilometers. That's 140 miles. They're capable of traveling as many as 140 miles a day, every day, for up to 30, 40 days without rest. This was data that were taken from a tag, actually several tags that were deployed on Antarctic killer whales. And they make this trek from Antarctica up to the tip of South America at least once a year. And they do not feed very much when they're doing this. And so they are capable of enduring very long distance travel on their own steam. And they do it, you know, pretty much without stopping. And I can get into why they do that. Maybe that's a question for somebody to ask later. For the purposes of pointing out how much ground they cover and how active they are, I don't think that's really the point. The point is how much ground they cover and how active they are. So they also dive deeply. These are diving mammals. All of the whales and dolphins are diving mammals. So are seals, sea lions. All of the marine mammals spend a lot of their time under the water, and they are air-breathing mammals just like we are. So the adaptations they have for diving like that are pretty sophisticated, pretty cool. And, you know, orcas can dive up to 500 meters. We know that they can actually dive deeper than that. And again, this is all from tagging them. A shallow dive for them is 21 feet, 20 feet, 25 feet, 7 meters. That's a shallow dive. All right. The deepest tank is about 30, 35 feet. So, you know, a shallow dive being 20 feet should tell you something if all you give them is 10 feet more. Their deep dives are, you know, 600 feet, 900 feet, and we're not giving them anything even close to that. Look at the last line there. It says they dive deeper than 150 meters. That's about 400 feet, at least once every 5 hours. This is just to hunt, to look for food, to socialize, to explore. This is just what they're doing every day of their lives. And this is a great graphic that I use a lot in my presentations. This is a tag that was deployed on an adult male killer whale in the wild. He carried this tag for several hours. It was a suction cup that attached to his skin, and then it just popped off and the researchers recovered it. Left to right, that yellow line is the track of his dive, is 5 minutes. So he spent 5 minutes under the surface of the water. And if you think about how long we can hold our breath, which is about 4 minutes max, they can hold their breath for up to 15, 20 minutes. Some species of whales and dolphins, and I'm not joking, can hold their breath for up to 2 hours. These are air-breathing mammals, and they can hold their breath for up to 2 hours. There are all sorts of amazing adaptations they have in their physiology for doing that. So it's not that they aren't going down with any oxygen. They are carrying that oxygen in their blood, in their muscle tissue, very little of it actually in their lungs. And that's just because over the many millennia that they've existed, they have been looking for food down there. And so they have developed these adaptations to tolerate that kind of diving behavior. So from left to right in this particular whale's case, it's 5 minutes. Look how deep he goes, 525 feet. And he does something down there. He just doesn't go down there and then come right back up. He mills around down there. He was probably chasing a fish. And then he comes back up on the right-hand side. This is one dive in one day he probably did this kind of dive multiple times. Remember, I told you they dive up to 150 meters. That's about 450, 500 feet, multiple times a day. And he's just, so this is just one dive out of it. He probably did this again and again and again. This is just a track of a single dive. If you look at the middle of the graph, upper middle corner, there is a pale blue rectangular cube. That is SeaWorld. That is the comparative volume that we provide them in a facility like SeaWorld. And there are up to 10 whales in that space. So from just one dive, let alone the horizontal distance he covers, the vertical space he wants, the vertical space he uses, 525 feet over 5 minutes. And then we give them this little tiny space in the middle of the graph. It's not sufficient to allow them to do anything close to natural behavior, and it's not sufficient to safeguard their welfare. So this is a photograph of Lolita, or Tokate. If some of you have read about her in the media recently, she just passed away in August of last year, but she lived in this enclosure, this tiny, look at her, there she is, and this is her enclosure. She lived in this enclosure for 53 years. 53 years. And you might say, well, then, you know, obviously if she can live for 53 years in this space, it's more than enough. Well, there was another whale with her named Hugo, and he died in 1980. She's been there, she had been there since 1970, and she'd lived with him for 10 years, and then he died. And many, many whales in captivity, many, many orcas in captivity had died and have died in the meantime while she persisted for 53 years. It wasn't that this enclosure is okay, it's that Tokate, again, Lolita was her stage name, Tokate was a very, very strong animal, and she simply endured. She didn't thrive, she barely coped, but she endured for 53 years in this tiny, tiny space. It was not legal, and the US government finally admitted that just before she died. This is actually too small by US standards, and it's just too small. Even a slightly bigger enclosure will meet the standards. The standards are actually ridiculous. They're so weak, so inadequate. But this tank didn't even meet those inadequate standards. But even if it did, it wouldn't be enough space. SeaWorld wildly exceeds the minimum standards that the US requires. And you saw the last graphic, so you can see that the standards aren't great. Beluga whales, same problem. They can travel up to 60, 70 kilometers. Again, that's about 40 miles in 24 hours. And they can dive very deep. They're even deeper divers than orcas are. They can dive well past 900 meters, which is about 2,700, 3,000 feet. That's almost a mile. Okay, so they can dive down to incredible depths. And you have to also think about the pressure. If any of you are snorkelers or scuba divers, you know that water pressure increases very, very quickly as you go down. And that's also a problem for us, not just the fact that we're holding our breath or taking air down with us in a tank. We can't breathe underwater. Not only that, but we actually are subjected to pressure. And some of the air in our lungs and our tissues are forced. Some of the air in our lungs is forced into our tissues. And then if we come up too fast, we get the bends. The bends are when those gases that we forced into our tissues through the water pressure come out of our tissues and back into our body before they have a chance to sort of be put back where they belong, which is in our lungs. And you end up getting literally air bubbles in your joints, and you end up in excruciating agony. Well, these animals don't get the bends. Somehow or other, they have adapted to these deep dives. They have the same issues, although they do not take any air down in their lungs. They exhale before they dive. And that forces all the air out of their lungs. Almost 90% of their air in their lungs will be forced out in that final exhale. They are carrying all of their oxygen. Their oxygen tank is in their blood and in their muscle tissue. So they have far more hemoglobin molecules than we do. And they also have something called myoglobin, which we do as well, which is how you carry oxygen in your muscle tissues. And they have a lot more of that than we do as well. Their muscle tissues are so red, they're almost black, like deep, deep, deep brick red, because they have so many oxygen atoms being held onto the myoglobin. So again, they are deep divers. They move great distances horizontally. And this is what we give them in captivity. So this is a facility in China. It's not really representative of what you'll find in the US, but we're not much better. We have a similar sized tank sometimes, but just fewer animals in them. So there's actually 7 or 8 animals in this single tank. And it's not much bigger than the photograph on outside the margins of the photograph. It's not sufficient for these animals. So social groupings are very different from the wild and in captivity. In the wild, you see this. Upper left is belugas, lower right is orcas. So in the upper left, it's just a big group of belugas coming together to socialize and feed. I'm sure there are fish there that they are feeding on. And they will be in groups of up to 1,000 animals when that's going on. The smallest groups you'll see them in is about 4 or 5 animals, but these gatherings of 1,000 or more are very common. In the lower right, that's a family. You might often hear that whales and dolphins live in family groups. That's not always true. Belugas don't necessarily live in family groups. Mothers and calves are always together, but once the calves grow up, they might leave their mother. Well, in orcas, all of her offspring, adult females' offspring, are going to stay with her one way or the other throughout her life. So that is a group that is centered on the mother, a matriarch, and then it's brothers and sisters. And, this is the smallest, youngest here. And notice it's in the middle of the line of animals because that's the youngest and needs to be protected from things like currents and waves and boats and all the hazards that are out there. So they put the littlest one in the middle. But the big males in this family group are sons, not mates. So it's a matriarch and all of her offspring, including her adult sons. And so you might ask, do they mate with their mothers? Do they mate with their sisters? No. They will leave their mother for up to hours or even days. They will mate with an unrelated female, and then they will come home to their mother. And the fact is that in the summer, when they're not breeding that much, they are within a body length of their mother. These are the adult males, the adult sons. They are within a body length of their mother for 70% of the time. That's in the wild. In captivity, we take all of that away from them. We take all of their social structure away from them. All of their natural social structure, particularly the family bonds in orcas, cannot be accommodated in captivity. This is Kiska. She's also passed away 2 years ago. She was all alone. Tokate was alone as well since Hugo died in 1980, but she had some dolphins with her, some Pacific white-sided dolphins with her. She was never completely alone. Kiska was alone. There were no other animals in there with her because when they tried to put other species of whale or dolphin in there with her, she attacked them. She used to have other orcas with her. This facility, which is in Canada, did have 4 or 5 belugas in that enclosure at one point, but they all died one after the other and left Kiska alone. And in her final year, she started showing some extremely distressing behavior, thrashing around. She may have had some illness, but she may have also just been mentally disturbed because she was completely solitary. And this is a species that lives in family groups for life. Again, belugas. Those are 2 belugas in that enclosure. There's some texture in that enclosure. Those are fake rocks, but nevertheless, the belugas probably can't really tell the difference. But just 2 animals. Again, they can often gather in groups of 1,000 or more. They never have that in captivity. They can't be accommodated socially in captivity. So the third thing that is very different between the wild and captivity is environmental quality and complexity. Again, we're talking about the ocean. We're talking about, algae, other, fish, birds, invertebrates, just so much complexity in the ocean environment, just like a rainforest or woodland. There's just so much textural complexity, biological complexity, and the weather and tides and currents and just on and on. And we give them a pool, a swimming pool. Very similar, by the way, to the swimming pools you have in your backyard or at a hotel. They are literally, in very many circumstances, for example, in this particular facility, which is SeaWorld, that's artificial salt water. They do give them salt water, but if they're not close to the ocean, they have to buy bags of artificial sea salt from manufacturers and pour it into fresh water that they get from the city system. So this is not the ocean. This isn't a facsimile of the ocean. In some cases, zoo and aquarium animals, you can do that. You can provide them with a facsimile of their habitat, and the animal isn't really even aware that it's not out there on the savanna or on a coral reef. We can't do that with whales and dolphins, primarily because of their size, but also because we have to keep that enclosure as clean as we can, or else they're going to get sick. And to do that, you can't keep any other living species in there. Fish, plants, they're going to be killed off by the hygiene methods you use to keep the water clean. Again, this is Marineland in France, so I'm taking you around the world with these photographs. This is a very common thing that you will see. It's called logging. It is literally that. It's acting like a log. As you may know, logs float in the water. So if you're in an area where they're cutting down trees, you will often see big logs floating along in the water because that's what they do. And that behavior is acting like a log, logging. And it's not completely unnatural. They do this in the wild, but often, well, I've never seen them do it for longer than 2 or 3 minutes. They will often do it for hours in captivity. And it's simply because they're bored. It's simply because they don't have a lot of space. It's simply because they're too big to do anything terribly active. They can't really build up a good head of steam and go fast. They can't dive deeply because the tank isn't that deep. So they spend a lot of time literally doing nothing, which, by the way, if you've ever seen these animals in the wild and how dynamic they are, this is really sad. So the final thing that's really different between the wild and captivity is their behavioral restrictions. These are the ocean's top predator. Orcas, even belugas, they are considered top predators. Orcas are the top predator. Some of them kill belugas. That makes them the top predator. So when you put them in captivity, you are taking away a lot of their behavioral options, all right? Particularly their predator-prey relationships. They do not hunt in captivity. They're fed. And you might think, oh, that makes it better. They don't have to work so hard. But working hard is what they do in the wild. Working hard is what we do in our lives. And when we are, underemployed or not, we don't have anything to do, we get bored. You get bored. I get bored. They get bored at the very least by not having a job to do. And boredom can lead to depression, and depression can kill. So here you are with the top marine predator, the orca, hunting in Patagonia and Alaska. They're pulling pups off the beach in Patagonia. They are knocking Dall's porpoise right into the air. False killer whales in Monterey Bay off of California. They're knocking them into there. They're ramming them to death. I mean, it's nature red in tooth and claw. It's hard to watch, but this is how they make their living. This is how they feed. And so that's what they have been adapted to do, is hunt for other marine mammals. This is, I'll tell you in a second that there's another type of killer whale out there. In captivity, when you take these mammal eaters, this is how you feed them: dead fish. They are all fed dead fish because that's the cheapest thing you can feed them. And you don't feed, they used to try way back in the 60s, they were actually trying to feed these animals steaks. They actually would try to feed them, beef. And they marine mammals is one thing, but not beef. It made them sick. And so fish don't make them sick, but if they are mammal eaters, it is depriving them of probably some nutrients and certainly what they're naturally adapted to eat. And if you ever see a picture of an orca or a bottlenose dolphin or any cetacean with its head up in the air like that and its mouth open, the head up in the air is called spy hopping, but their mouths are closed. If you ever see them like that with their mouth open, they're in captivity. No matter what the water looks like, they are in captivity, because in captivity, dead food falls from the sky, from the trainer's hands. That is not how it works in the wild. Food doesn't come from the sky. It comes from underwater. And so that position, that posture is a captive posture. So some orcas are fish eaters. They're vegetarians, if you will. They're not. I mean, fish are animals. But, you know, they're sort of, I always call them the vegetarians in the orca world. They literally do not eat marine mammals. They only eat fish. It's really fascinating, these different prey preferences that you'll find in different populations. And so this is a fish herding, you know, actually working in cooperation to get a herring school into a big ball. And then they take turns to move through this herring ball to get food from it. And again, this is the Miami Seaquarium when Tokate was still alive, performing. You know, with cartoon characters, with Marvel characters, it's not natural. It's not educational, in my opinion. It's pure entertainment, and it is not respectful, in my opinion. So the impacts of captivity on orcas and belugas, what all the stuff I've been telling you about, what actually happens to the animals because they don't hunt, because they log a lot, because they are held in artificial seawater, because the space is so small for them. What happens to them? Well, in the case of belugas, they don't breed very well. And we are now seeing that in real time in the United States. They've been trying very hard to get their belugas to breed, and they don't. They don't very well. They may get pregnant. They may even give birth, but the calf usually doesn't live very long. They very often, you know, abort the fetus. They just, the pregnancy is not successful. It terminates. Why? We don't really know. They haven't tried to do research on it. They just want them to give birth. They want them to, you know, reproduce in captivity. And when it doesn't work, they just keep trying to make it work. And they have done some research on artificial insemination, which they do use with these animals, which allows them not to move the males around, which they used to do a lot. But still, the females are not bringing these babies to term, or the babies are born and they don't survive. And so this is a situation where they keep trying to import more. They tried in 2012 to bring in 18 wild-caught belugas from Russia, but it was illegal under US law, so they failed to get that permit, that import permit. And any species that breeds well in captivity may or may not have its welfare maximized. Most of the time, it doesn't mean that. You may be aware of like puppy mills, and obviously the dogs in puppy mills do not have their welfare maximized. They're being kept in miserable conditions, but they reproduce. So a good breeding record doesn't mean your welfare is safeguarded, but a bad breeding record does mean your welfare is compromised. If you don't breed in captivity, your welfare is compromised. If you do, it may or may not be. So the fact that belugas don't breed well in captivity is not a good sign for their welfare. This, again, I'm just picking some examples of what happens to these animals in captivity. There's a whole slew of issues that they face. One is for orcas, in fact, for all whales and dolphins in captivity, even the bottlenose dolphins who cope better, again, not well, but they cope better than these larger species, they have bad teeth. And bad teeth lead to bad health, even in all mammals, in your cat and your dog and in you. If you have bad teeth, you're going to have bad health. And so these guys should have teeth like this. This animal is dead. It was found stranded on the beach, but look at its teeth, big, conical, traffic cone teeth, really, really healthy teeth, even though the animal died of something else. But in captivity, they grind their teeth down. And they grind their teeth down through neurotic, repetitive behavior. If you're familiar with horses, they crib. They crib on the sides of their stalls. It's very similar to that. They're just rubbing their bottom jaw teeth up and down on the concrete and wearing their teeth right down to the jawline. In the lower picture here, this is, just worn right down to the jawline. You see the cavities. They get cavities, but you can't fill them. You can't fill the cavities because they live in water. And if you tried to fill it with a filling, they just dive down to the bottom of the tank and it would all wash out. So they just have to leave these teeth open and wash them out constantly with antibiotics to prevent bacteria from getting in and making them sick. So look at down here on the lower right, those teeth are broken and that would hurt. Grinding them down is bad enough over days, months, years, but breaking them on the metal bars of their gates that separate the tanks, that's how they're breaking them. That's going to be painful, just as painful as it would be if you broke a tooth. So that's, again, a really clear sign of something's wrong with captivity. If they have beautiful teeth like the whale on the left, and what happens in 70%, this has been studied, this is a peer-reviewed paper, 70% of the orcas in captivity have bad teeth. 30% have decent teeth or even good teeth. Tokate actually had good teeth. She never developed that neurotic behavior. But 70%, which is a huge number, of the captive orcas, bottlenose dolphins, belugas, in captivity have bad teeth. So again, something's wrong. So dorsal fin collapse, I'm sure you've all heard of this. And this, again, is not unique to orcas. It doesn't happen in belugas because they don't have a dorsal fin. But it happens in bottlenose dolphins. It certainly happens in other dolphins that are held. But the reason it's so spectacular in orcas is because males have very tall dorsal fins. All right. So what you get is this. That tall dorsal fin there has completely flopped over. And I use the word flop, but it's not that it just sort of fell over. It grew that way. If you've ever seen a tree that lives on a very windy coast and it's kind of, bent in the direction of the wind that blows constantly along the coast, it didn't get blown over by the wind. It grew that way because of the wind. So this is a gravity problem because captive cetaceans, whales and dolphins, spend so much of their time at the surface versus diving, which they do, as you know from my data earlier in the talk. They spend most of the time below the surface in the wild. They spend most of their time, they spend most of their time below the surface in the wild, and they spend most of their time at the surface in captivity. So gravity doesn't act underwater. It's kind of why they train astronauts in water. It's kind of a zero gravity situation, not entirely, but it simulates zero gravity a lot better than anything we can do in the air. And so they train astronauts a lot in the water. So it doesn't really act in the water. And so the wild whales and dolphins who spend most of their time below the surface, their dorsal fin will just grow up straight and tall. And it's only connective tissue in there and fat. There's no bone, no cartilage. So it has to grow that way to be that way, if you will. Then in captivity, where they spend most of their time at the surface, they are born normal, or they come into captivity normal as when they were caught from the wild as juveniles. But slowly, when it reaches some critical height to base width ratio, starts to grow this way. And then it finally just grows, curled over. If you went up there and tried to move that dorsal fin, it would be pretty firm. It's not floppy. It's pretty firm. It grew that way. So again, this is, we don't know whether this is a health problem for them. It might very well be, but we don't know because they haven't done the research, by the way. But it's certainly it's emblematic, symptomatic, if you will, of being in captivity. It's not normal for the wild. Now, you may say, does it never happen in the wild? Well, it does. This is a wild male killer whale who had his dorsal fin flop over, and that actually did flop over. It grew normally. Notice it's different from the one on the left. It's kind of different from this animal. It has a fairly straight up and down base of about 1.5 feet to 2 feet. Then right in the middle, it flops over. This animal was shot. Not a pleasant thing for a wild whale. Some fishermen got angry at it for taking a fish or something like that and shot it. It got shot right in the middle of the dorsal fin, and the connective tissue in there and the fat destabilized from the wound, and the whole dorsal fin literally did collapse. This is actually, if you went up to this one, you'd be able to move it a little bit. It's kind of like a limb that's flopping around because you broke the bone. So that does happen, but only in about 1% to 5% of killer whales in the wild. Through illness or injury, some dorsal fins of adult males will fall over like this. It's almost 100%. 95% of adult male killer whales in captivity have this collapsed dorsal fin. This is what the dorsal fin is supposed to look like. This is an adult male killer whale in the wild with a perfectly healthy fin, which is 95 to 99% of the adult male killer whales in the wild. They have perfectly healthy fins, and it's straight up and down for 5 or 6 feet. This is what happens in captivity. This is what happens in the wild when there's an injury or illness. This is normal. This is not normal. And then there's some other data here that show you that they don't survive very well. And this is one of the really strong data streams that shows that they don't cope, let alone thrive in captivity. For orcas, you notice that there is an age at sexual maturity. In the wild, 81% of the juveniles reach sexual maturity, but in captivity, less than half. Menopause is actually something that orcas experience, just like we do. It's very rare in the animal kingdom. Most, even females, most animals in the animal kingdom breed until they die. All right, their value is in reproduction, and so they die when they no longer can reproduce. Well, orcas have some value beyond their ability to reproduce. Apparently, they have knowledge, they have status, something that is of value to the rest of the group. And so they actually go through menopause. Their bodies no longer can reproduce, but they continue to survive, just like we do. I've gone through menopause, so there you go. I hope I still have value. In the wild, about half of the adult females reach that age. Only 7% reach that age in captivity. So I'm not saying that, you don't have old killer whales in captivity. We have a couple, literally a couple, that have reached what would be seen as old age even in the wild. But the vast majority of captive orcas die when they are still considered young adults or even juveniles and adolescents. They don't even make it to adulthood. The vast majority of them die young. Oh, and just notice at the bottom there that at best, captive orcas live as long as endangered and threatened wild orcas in the wild. So whatever's happening to them in captivity that kills them, and again, exactly what those things are, the industry, the zoo and aquarium world won't do that research. So I can only tell you what I think is happening with the bad teeth and all of that. But whatever's killing them in captivity at relatively young ages is the same as no fish, pollution, boat strikes, whatever's killing them to the point where they're endangered or threatened in the wild. That's nothing to write home about. Right? What you want them to do is live as long as healthy, orca populations in the wild, and there still are quite a few of those, including in British Columbia, where I did my dissertation research, and they don't live anywhere near as long as those whales do. Those whales live as long as we do. We live, 80, 90 years, so do they, but not in captivity. Belugas, as far as we know, their lifespans are about halved in captivity, which is extraordinary, right? We're not entirely sure of this because we know less about wild belugas than we do about wild orcas. It's harder to study belugas because they live up in the far north. They're Arctic animals. And so we just know less about them. But what we do know suggests that their lifespans are halved in captivity. Again, that's terrible. A lot of argument for keeping these animals in captivity is that they add to our information, education, research, conservation. We need information, and these animals are available, so there's all this research being done with them, and it helps animals in the wild and conservation. But look, we basically have noticed just through our own research that that's not true. But some researchers who actually support keeping these animals in captivity because they study questions that can be answered with captive animals, they actually did an analysis of the literature to rebut our argument that they don't publish that much, that they don't publish scientific literature that much. And they found that only 11% of peer-reviewed papers were on studies that had any value to the animals in the wild. Okay. And they're basically looking at things like cognition, which might have value in the wild, or husbandry, how to keep them healthier in captivity, which is, in my opinion, impossible. You can't keep them healthier in captivity. So the more research they do on that, the more they just don't improve their welfare, the more I'm convinced that, I'm right and they're wrong. These animals don't belong in captivity. So I just found it interesting that, they were basically saying we were wrong when we said they didn't publish that much, but then they did their own analysis and they published it in the literature to give them credit. And it showed pretty much what we found, that they don't publish that much. And that is still true today in 2024. They're trying to improve their publication record. to do more research, to do more science, to do more education. But they've only improved a little bit with bottlenose dolphins. They've done very little with belugas and very little with orcas. They also still capture these animals from the wild. They capture very few zoo species still from the wild. They don't capture zebras from the wild. They don't even capture lions and tigers from the wild. Those animals are being bred successfully in captivity. As you have now heard, none of these species breed all that well in captivity. And so certainly in some cases, the only option they have is to keep going to the wild and capturing them there. Now, if you've absorbed some of the information I told you about the lifestyles of these animals in the wild, family living, groups of 1,000, going out and capturing them is very traumatic for them. These are intelligent animals. They know very well that something terrible is happening. And, they panic. They often get entangled in the nets that the capture operators use, and they drown. It is an extremely traumatic and dangerous operation to catch these animals in the wild, not because the animals attack the capture operators, but dangerous for the animals because they panic and they can suffer what's known as capture myopathy and just basically have a heart attack and die. So it is an extremely dangerous thing for the animals, not for the capture operators, and yet they still do it. All in the name of research, education, and conservation, but it's really for entertainment, our entertainment. So this is just a indication of how many animals have just recently been taken from the wild. This is not something that used to happen in the past. It's happening now. Fortunately, a law has just been passed in Russia that outlaws this. So we're hoping it sticks. We don't know that it will be a solid statute that is enforced, but at the moment, there are no captures going on in Russia anymore. That was the source. Notice all of these captures are from either Kamchatka or the Sea of Okhotsk, all of which are Russian territory. So they were capturing and selling their belugas, their orcas for the aquarium trade all the way up until 2018. So very recently. But my community, myself, we worked very hard to try to end those captures, and we succeeded. And at the moment, it is illegal to capture both belugas and orcas in Russia. And we can only hope that that remains the case. But as you can see, a very large number of these animals went to China. And that is the market, even today, wherever these animals are being captured from the wild, and not just orcas and belugas, but bottlenose dolphins and so on. The market, the big market, is China. So I am also working there. I was just in China last month, and we're trying to raise public awareness so that they don't demand a constant supply of live whales and dolphins for entertainment purposes. This is how they do it. This is that blue tarp on board the deck there. That there's actually an animal inside that box. So there's a box here. It looks like a rectangular box, and it is. It's lined with a blue tarp, and there's a beluga inside that. So they capture them, they haul them up the side of the boat, and they put them in these boxes, and then they take them to shore, and they put them in pens there, and then they sell them either to facilities in Russia. Some of them have gone to the Middle East, and a whole bunch of them have gone to China. This is what it looks like where they are being held. This was the infamous whale jail, which was all over the news. I'm not sure any of you are old enough to remember that, but it was all over the news in the summer of 2018. 100 and, let's see if I can remember the number, 101 belugas and whales, orcas, belugas and orcas were caught in the Sea of Okhotsk and held in this holding facility near Vladivostok, which is a city in the far east of Russia. And I actually went to Vladivostok to see if I could see this facility, and it was 40 kilometers further on, and I never did see it, but it was extremely disturbing to be that close to it. And I did find out a lot about the facility while I was there. Anyway, they had, this huge number of animals there, and these aerial photos were taken by activists, not by the people who were running this facility. And it embarrassed the Russian government. So they basically closed the place down, and they either had to release these whales or, where they were caught, or just release them off Vladivostok. So they did both. 4 of the whales did die during the time all these protests were going on, but the vast majority of them were either released where they were caught or released just off of Vladivostok. Some of those animals, it's not natural habitat for belugas, by the way. Some of those animals are still alive. We know that for sure. So some of the orcas have survived, totally reintegrated into their pods up in the north. And then off Vladivostok, there are still belugas seen, even though that's not natural habitat. It's these belugas. So they have survived. So, you know, very soon after they're caught, they can be returned to the wild. They're very smart animals. They have very long memories. The longer they stay in captivity, the more damaged they become mentally and physically, and it may not be possible to return them to the wild. Mystic Aquarium here in the United States brought in 5 young belugas born in captivity in Canada for research purposes. They wanted to do some research. The Mystic Aquarium does have a research program. And we protested simply because the parents of these captive-born belugas were from Russia. Canada didn't have any laws that kept them out when they were importing them to Canadian facilities. We did. We have the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And so nobody could bring in wild-caught Russian belugas to the United States, but they could bring them in to Canada. And then they bred them there. And again, it's not that they don't breed at all, but most of the calves don't survive. So they had quite a few because they brought in so many. They brought in about 25, 30 wild-caught belugas to Canada. And they, it's basically a puppy mill for belugas. So they did breed, but a lot of the calves did die, but some of them survived. And 5 of those were brought into the United States not too long ago in 2021 during the pandemic. And so I'm just telling you right now, look at what it says at the bottom there. 3 of the animals have died and 1 was very sick. They brought in 5 young belugas, and within 3 years, 60% of them are dead. Not what they intended. They meant for them to live their normal lifespan, 30, 40, 50 years, and do research on them. They were all dead before they were 15. I think the eldest was about 9 years old when she died. And 4th one was sick, but she has recovered. So there's only 2 left, one of which has been very ill, but has recovered, and one which seems to have never had any health problems at all. But the other 3 had pre-existing conditions. They transported sick whales. This is a facility with a very good reputation. It's so important for them to have new belugas, fresh blood, as we say, new genes for the breeding pool, that they transported sick animals, absolutely confident they could bring them back to health, and instead they died. There's a lot of literature out there for you, popular literature, documentaries, books, nonfiction books that you can read. Death at SeaWorld is a book. Blackfish, of course, you may know Blackfish. It's a documentary that's become quite famous, was released 11 years ago, but is still very topical. Beneath the Surface, which is written by one of the trainers that was featured in Blackfish. Born to be Free is about all of the Russian beluga trade I've been talking about. Fascinating documentary about what goes on inside Russia, made by a Russian filmmaker. And then Long Gone Wild is basically a sequel, not officially, but it is basically a sequel to Blackfish. The filmmaker, a different filmmaker, decided to follow up to see what had happened since Blackfish, and he did Long Gone Wild. And so I urge you to see the 3 documentaries. They're available somewhere on the interwebs. And then the 2 books, are easily available from Amazon. Death at SeaWorld has been optioned for a TV show, so we're really hopeful that it will be made into a TV show, and I think that will bring the story of what happened 11 years ago back to a new audience. So we're very hopeful that project is moving forward. So with any luck, there will be an adaptation, a fiction adaptation of the nonfiction story of what happened when the trainer was killed at SeaWorld. Again, I'm not sure how many of you know about all of that, but you can find out by reading Death at SeaWorld. I have done a TEDx talk. That's me down there with long hair. I have done a TEDx talk on sort of the welfare of these animals in captivity, but looking at it through the eyes of the fact that they live in these families. So you can just Google my my name and TEDx, and you'll find that. And then again, I told you I was in China not too long ago, and We did 2 investigative reports. And, like I said, a lot of the orcas and belugas that were caught in Russia back before the captures were banned went to China. And so I went to see how they were doing, and they're not doing very well. The belugas in particular are not doing very well there, but the orcas are full of neuroses, their teeth aren't good, and so on. So even though they built slightly bigger enclosures, they were 39 feet deep instead of, just 35 feet deep. So 4 or 5 feet deeper. They're not doing well. That's me in the middle there. That's an audience that I spoke to in Hangzhou just last month. And again, this is what we're doing. We're trying to raise public awareness in China, which is a tough society to influence because the government is very, very nervous about Western influence in society in China. And so the fact that I am able to do this, we're taking advantage of it as long as we can. And a lot of these individuals are actually very well educated about this issue. They do have access to some of the internet. China does try to block a lot of things. They block Facebook, for example. But, they have learned quite a bit about this issue, and they are very, very eager to learn more. This is a paper I co-authored. You can see my name there in the second slot there. This is a paper I co-authored with colleagues on the harmful effects of captivity and chronic stress on the well-being of orcas. So again, this is a peer-reviewed scientific paper that looks at all of the impacts they suffer. Again, not just the teeth, but a number of health issues that they suffer. And there's a what I call a white paper. It is basically meant to be a guidebook for anybody interested in this issue. That I've co-authored. This is now the 6th edition. Again, just Google the case against marine mammals in captivity and you'll find it online. It's pretty long. It's about 186 pages, and some of it's very, very small print because it's got endnotes, but it's full of facts and figures for you, full of the resources that I have just been citing in that small print on the slides. All of the science. We try to base our arguments on science. It's not just an emotional or even ethical argument. These animals do not cope in captivity. They shouldn't be there. So those are my contact details. I still call it Twitter. It's hard for me to shift to X. But these are all the ways you can contact me. If you do have questions that you don't feel comfortable asking right now, you can, of course, just go ahead and email me, and I promise you I will reply. Now I'm going to turn on, oops, no, I'm not. I'm going to get out of, there we go, Q&A. I'm going to start answering the questions, and so please don't hesitate to ask more if you want to. How do I feel about the documentaries that are released to the public about whales in captivity? What is your take on it? So as you saw from one of my last slides, I mentioned several of those documentaries: Blackfish, Long Gone Wild, Born to Be Free. I actually assisted in making most of those. I advised the director of Blackfish. I'm in Long Gone Wild and Born to Be Free. I fully support them. I think that is an excellent way to reach the public, is through documentaries. One of the interesting things about the way that works legally is if a company that's targeted by a documentary like that can demonstrate that it suffered financially because of misinformation in a documentary, then they can sue the filmmaker. SeaWorld did very clearly suffer financially because of Blackfish. They had to admit that because they're a publicly owned company, they have shareholders, and their stock took an incredible dive after Blackfish came out. And they had to admit that it was a result of Blackfish because their shareholders were telling them it was a result of Blackfish. And they got into trouble with the Security and Exchange Commission because they tried to pretend it wasn't because of Blackfish initially. And they were fined for lying to their shareholders. So the point is they did, in fact, suffer financially because of the film. So if it was inaccurate, they absolutely should have sued. I'm the first person to say, if you can prove that there are inaccuracies in this film, sue us, sue the director, sue the production company. They never did because, in fact, they would have lost in court. The film was largely accurate. any inconsistencies or inaccuracies were extremely minor and had no bearing on the overall argument that these animals don't belong in captivity. Has there been any success in using offshore pens? I'm assuming that question is about seaside sanctuaries. And Keiko, who was the whale who starred in the film Free Willy, is actually the test case. He never returned to the wild. He never actually reintegrated with wild whales successfully. But he was essentially the first orca who had been in captivity for a very long time. He was 17 years old when he first was returned to Iceland. And he'd been caught as a very young animal, maybe as young as a year, although they say he was 2.5. And so he'd been in captivity for 15 years or more. And he returned quite successfully to natural habitat. He didn't reintegrate with wild whales, but for 5.5 years, essentially, he was in sanctuary. So yes, I think sea pen sanctuaries, seaside sanctuaries are going to be the future for some whales and dolphins, but not for all of them. There's about 3,000 whales and dolphins in captivity globally, and we aren't going to be able to build enough seaside sanctuaries to house them all. Some of them are going to be able to be released to the wild because they were caught very recently in Russia or Japan. That's where a lot of dolphins are coming from. And some of them are going to have to stay where they are. But we can improve their welfare where they are. There are ways. If you de-emphasize the performance and you don't make it all about making money and you don't push them so hard that you make a lot of money, you can improve their welfare from what it currently is, even in the facilities they are. Even Tokute, the whale who was in that teeny tiny tank for 53 years, her welfare improved near the end. She just got sick. She was elderly. She was, in fact, an older female, even for a wild whale, and she got sick and she couldn't handle it and she died. So, I think that we can improve the welfare of the vast majority of whales and dolphins that are going to have to stay where they are. Is it true that places like the Shedd Aquarium are breeding belugas? Oh, absolutely. They're trying anyway. Is not attending these facilities the best way to combat this? Absolutely. This is a commercial enterprise. Vote with your wallet. Don't buy a ticket. Is there any legislation protecting large sea mammals from these practices? Yes and no. There is legislation. It's called the Animal Welfare Act. But as I mentioned to you, the regulations in the United States are weak. They are poor. And we are trying to strengthen them, but that has been a long process. I've been doing this for 31 years. And one of my jobs for that 31 years has been trying to improve the standards, the legal standards for keeping these animals in captivity. And so far, I haven't had much success. It is just incredible how difficult it has been. But we are currently considering a bill in Congress, which again, my organization, Animal Welfare Institute, is working on. We're trying to pass a bill that would prohibit the public display of orcas, belugas, false killer whales, and pilot whales, the 4 larger species who clearly cannot cope with captivity. If this bill passes, it's just been reintroduced. We've been trying for a couple of years now. If it passes, it would make it illegal to hold these animals. The ones who are currently in captivity would be grandfathered in, but you couldn't breed them and you couldn't bring in any more. And so they would be the last generation. And that's already the case for orcas in California. A state statute passed back in 2016, which made it illegal to breed or bring in any more orcas into the state. So the few orcas that are remaining at SeaWorld in San Diego are the last orcas. They can't breed it. They haven't had a birth there in 6 years, and they won't. They won't have any more birds there. The last whale that was born the female was pregnant when the bill passed. And so she gave birth, and that's the last birth they've had. They haven't been breeding them. And they have not been importing any from anywhere else because they can't. It's illegal in California. So in my job, I'm trying to make sure that becomes a federal law. How often do whales get held captive each year? And how many get captured? Well, right now, the main species that are being targeted for capture from the wild are the smaller species: bottlenose dolphins, bristled dolphins, false killer whales. Well, false killer whales are actually one of the largest species. They're still capturing them from the wild in Japan. So those individuals that are being captured from the wild in Japan are going to Asian and Russian markets, and some are now being sold to the Mideast. None of them are coming to the West. None of them are coming to North America. None of them are going to Europe. It's a very, very harsh and traumatic method they use there to capture these dolphins. And it doesn't meet the standards for the United States. It doesn't meet the standards for Europe. So they can't import those animals. That's the only place where active captures are still happening is Japan and Cuba. And again, the Cuba captures are bottlenose dolphins. As I mentioned, the law has been changed in Russia, so they can't capture orcas or belugas anymore. I always see these videos of belugas coming up to the glass and opening their mouths. That's a threat. When they come up to the glass and they open their mouth, it's called an open mouth threat. It's basically if you shook your fist at somebody, it's a clear threat. People think it's funny. They think they're smiling. That's one of the problems is we don't read these animals very well. They're so different from us that we don't understand their gestures and their facial expressions and all of that. Any cetacean that opens its mouth and bares all its teeth at you is shaking its fist at you. It's a threat. So there you go. It's an aggressive behavior. They're basically telling you to go away. They don't like you. Is there any pending legislation that might help protect these industries from capturing in the wild or breeding in captivity? I am assuming you mean protect the animals from being captured in the wild or bred in captivity. So yes, there's pending legislation. It's called the SWIMS Act, SWIMS. It's HR 8514. I can't remember the Senate number, but it's been introduced to both the Senate and the House, and we're working on that right now. Wouldn't the legislation probably have to be international? Yes, eventually we're going to need, well, let me take that back. No, it doesn't. In fact, we're getting down to the municipal level. Mexico City prohibits the public display of dolphins. We tried to do it at the 30,000 foot level. We tried to do it internationally. We tried to do it nationally. It was pretty difficult. We did succeed in Canada and a couple of other places, but in the end, we did succeed in California. We've succeeded at the municipal level in several places. Barcelona outlaws captive dolphins. Even South Carolina outlaws captive cetaceans, whales and dolphins. So we've had more success at the local level than at the national or international level. So in fact, that's how we're doing it in baby steps instead of all at once. It's unfortunate, but that's the way we've had to do it. Are there more male or female whales that are currently being held? Oh, no, it's about half and half. Orcas, there's more females. And that's actually one of the reasons they still breed. Again, they're not doing it in the United States anymore, but they are trying to breed them in China. And they've had 7 births there in China, 15 imported from Russia, and then 7 more have been born there in the last 10 years. So basically, if they have 1 or 2 males, they can get all the females pregnant. With belugas, it doesn't work like that. They need more than 1 male. The females won't become pregnant unless they have multiple males around them. It's an interesting physiological response. And so they need to have at least equal numbers, really, to successfully breed, which is one of their problems. They have more females than males, and so the females just aren't getting pregnant. What are things we should consider when thinking about in situ conservation and or recovery efforts for injured animals? So most of the bills that have actually passed, like in Canada and in California, for example, have exemptions for bringing in animals who've been rescued off the beach and need to be rehabilitated. If they can't be returned to the wild, then we are trying to develop these seaside sanctuaries for them. It's a better way of living, even if you have to stay in captivity, than being in a concrete tank. That's all the questions. Thanks so much, everybody.
All right. Thank you for your time here and for your presentation. We found it really informative. I hope everyone else found it just as informative. Is there anything else you want to say as we're
Nope.
wrapping?
I'm
All
really, really happy to be here, and I will be back next year.
right. We're glad to have had you. Thank you. Thank you. So this concludes our 6th webinar. We hope you enjoyed the presentation. To conclude our day on the MBTI, we have Naomi Rose and the protection of predators. Hope to see you there.